I'm not even going to pronounce her last name. But I'm going to turn over to her and let her tell you a little bit about herself and what she's going to share with us today. Okay? Sorry. There you go. You're welcome.
So, hi there, everybody.
Hi.
My name is Casey Teixeira. I am an MSW, but I also work with Kindred Hospice as a bereavement coordinator. So, can everybody see and hear me okay? Okay, good. So, my job, I'm responsible for maintaining contact with families once their loved one comes onto hospice to offer kind of the pre-bereavement support, and even in the time after when they have died for the next year, I'm available to meet in person or refer to support groups or just give some general education or readings about grief. I'm responsible for both the Richmond and Petersburg area, so I bounce around quite a bit. And what I was here to talk to you all about today is chronic disease, its relation with depression, and then kind of moving from depression to loss and how grief is different from depression, some myths about grief, some facts about grief, and then kind of touching on how we cope, or ideas or directions for heading towards coping. So that's pretty much what I wanted to jump on today. I'm only going to touch on chronic disease because I feel like you guys probably know more than I do about chronic disease in the sense of your own personal experience. But what I can tell you is that as of 2012, so my numbers are a little outdated, but 117 million people in the United States report having at least one chronic condition. And that's just one. There are others who have multiples. And so that's nearly, at the time of 2012, that was 50% of the population. So those are some pretty massive numbers, and how overwhelming. It was not something that I initially expected. So obviously having a chronic disease affects your quality of life, right? I mean, that's why you guys are here, you're talking with one another, you're seeking resources from one another, because it takes a pretty big toll. And so it's normal to feel pretty down if you get a diagnosis of a chronic illness. You know, you're starting to initially feel pretty sad and maybe thinking about your loss of independence or maybe just smaller losses along the way. And that's why depression is really sneaky, because you're expected to feel kind of sad when you have a major change in your life. But depression, major depressive disorder, according to the DSM-5, which is just a little manual book that a counselor or a psychiatrist would use to diagnose for depression, has a lot of criteria. So, show of hands if you feel comfortable, but how many of you people here would probably say that you think you've been depressed at one point in your life? And so the thing is that we definitely can feel pretty down, but for the DSM to get diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you have to have at least 5 of 9 criteria. And I'm sorry that I don't have a PowerPoint or anything to refer to. I didn't bring my USB device, and so silly me. But I still have plenty of this information to share. But those 9 criteria, first one is either sadness, irritability, anxiety, feelings of emptiness or inappropriate guilt, anhedonia, which just basically means you don't enjoy the things that you used to enjoy, whether that's intimacy with a partner, whether or not that's hobbies, things like that. Fatigue, so feeling generally exhausted. Restlessness or lethargic motor movement, and that's being observed by somebody else. Difficulty concentrating, remembering, or attention to detailed decisions. Sleep disturbances, either sleeping too much or not sleeping enough. Appetite changes, either eating too much or not eating enough. And the last one, the bigger one, about thoughts about ending your life or harming yourself. So of those 9, you have to have at least 5. And so that's why people don't necessarily get depressed, because you have to have at least 5 of those 9, almost all day or the entire day for 2 weeks straight. And that's how they have the criteria to pin it down. And it has to be a significant impact on your daily living. So don't worry if when I say all these things you go, man, I am clinically depressed. I don't get to diagnose you. I'm not in charge of that. At least not at this point. So a lot of those things there, though, the symptoms of depression kind of resemble some of the side symptoms that you have when you have a chronic illness, because it's inhibiting parts of your life. Major depression, from a study in 2014, only affects about 7 or 8% of the population. But when somebody has chronic illness, their rates of depression actually increase by a statistically significant amount, which just basically means somebody did a study and they said it was a statistically significant amount. But nearly a third of people who report having a chronic illness also end up having a period of time of major depression. It's generally more often in women than men. And the problem with depression is that depression can make your physical symptoms, like maybe pain or fatigue, even worse. It makes you more likely to engage in some behaviors that are not helpful for yourself, like you don't want to go out, you don't want to engage with others and maybe get out and get to know these resources. And maybe you're more likely to cope by doing things like drinking alcohol or smoking. And it makes you less likely to take care of yourself and maybe take your medications that are helping keeping your chronic illness in check. So it can make things even worse. And if you have any questions along the way, please let me know. So typical treatments for depression are medications, but it's not limited to that. There's also therapy, individual therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which really goes into when you're in a situation, is there something, like, are you thinking a particular way, and is that thought affecting how you behave from that point onwards? There's also group therapy or support groups. One of the other treatments from depression that as I was reading up, was saying that being able to get your chronic illness under control is something to help with your depression. So you might go, duh, but that can be helpful too. And then there are some more severe cases of depression, and that is when you have more involved treatments that go along the way. Does anybody have any questions for me, since I just kind of blew through there really quick about depression at all? Or would you like any more information about a particular part of it?
Are you talking about having these symptoms for 2 weeks, that then your insurance will pay for things?
For insurance paying for things, if you get diagnosed, they have to bill it medically. It's not just in the DSM, but the ICD-10, which is where all the diagnoses have like a little number and letter associated with them. Mainly my point is that we might think that we're depressed, but when it comes down to it, and if we actually saw a doctor or a specialist, they may tell us you actually don't have all of these things affecting you all at once.
I see.
And depression actually is being argued to be treated as a chronic disease in and of itself. Major depressive disorder is what I've been talking about, but there's also persistent depressive disorder, which is when it lasts for 2 years or longer. But I'm going to switch gears here and kind of address more of what my job is all about, and that's in loss. And as I had said earlier, loss doesn't have to simply be the death of a loved one. It can be loss of independence or loss of a relationship or losing a job. But grief, the actual definition of it is just the natural response that follows a loss. It's not limited to death, but it's generally death. Grief is something that's internal, how we feel, and mourning is how we externally express this grief. So mourning rituals like wearing black, or putting together a memorial service, or in the Jewish community sitting Shiva after they've lost somebody. So we don't get to choose how grief presents itself inside of us, but we do get to choose how we react to it. And how you express your grief is really important to being able to process it. So I actually brought a handout with me that I'll pass out to everybody. But the reason why I talked about depression first and then grief is because grief and depression can also both look very similar. So we can use out